Can you say, "This is Dr. Amanda Zelahusky"?
Why do we have to?
Just try it.
Oh, I can't.
Deep breath. Okay.
This is Dr. Amanda Zelahusky. Lindsay Malloy. Ah!
Now, wait, say Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
No, come back.
This is Dr. Lindsay Malloy. Welcome to the Parenting Podcast.
One more time.
And then after that, can we have a candy twist?
No.
Please, Mommy.
Okay, ready?
Pandemic Parenting Podcast.
Excellent.
Welcome to the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. I'm Dr. Amanda Zelahusky.
And I'm Dr. Lindsay Malloy. We are two psychologists, scholars, and moms, and together we co-founded Pandemic Parenting.
We're here to share science-based research and help all who care for kids navigate this challenging time together. While the pandemic lockdown brought challenges for us all, LGBTQ plus parents and youth faced particular challenges. Many LGBTQ plus youth who primarily found support and community outside of the home faced increased isolation from peers and mentors. For many parents in same-sex relationships, virtual work and school meant navigating increased visibility into their home lives. I had the opportunity to talk with longtime friends and colleagues, Dr. David Langer and Dr. Marissa Peifer, about these challenges, and I'm so grateful they were willing to share not only their expertise as psychologists working with LGBTQ plus youth, but also their own experiences as LGBTQ plus parents navigating the pandemic. In this episode, we delve into a range of topics, such as learning how to support your LGBTQ plus child, having conversations with your child about gender and sexuality, and advocating for yourself as an LGBTQ plus parent. Whether you're an LGBTQ plus parent, the parent of an LGBTQ plus child, or simply someone who wants to learn how to be a better ally to the LGBTQ plus community, Dr. Langer and Dr. Peifer remind all of us of the power of community, support, and curiosity. Let us know your thoughts or questions you have on this topic by tweeting us at Pandemic Parent or by sending a message through our website. Let's get into the conversation. So welcome to today's podcast. Today, we're going to be focusing a lot on LGBTQ plus families, and I'm so thrilled to be welcoming two friends and colleagues, Dr. Marissa Peifer and Dr. David Langer. Welcome to you both. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for
having us.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start just with, how both of you are doing. So, and what the last year and a half of pandemic parenting has looked like for you in your household. So Marissa, let's start with you. How are you?
It's so nice to even have a moment to even reflect on that question, because it feels like this year and a half has been so just saturated with everything. So I'm doing as well as I could imagine being, and I'm fortunate to have flexible work, and I'm doing as well as we can be. We have a 6-year-old and an almost 4-year-old, and so it's been a wild ride in that way. But all things considered, we are lucky to be doing as well as we are.
Yeah, great. Thanks for being here. And David, how are you?
Yeah, I echo what Marissa was saying, and it's been a year of challenges and rewards. And my husband and I are fortunate enough to have been able to hold on to our jobs and work remotely. We have twin 6-year-olds, and it's also been like trying to balance remote learning and watching them and supervising them at the same time as working. It has certainly been a balance, but I think we're also very lucky to have had work and be in a place where they could stay safe. We could continue our work and parenting.
Yeah, balancing so many different things, I think, is a theme for all of us this year with lots of these different layers and contexts. So one of the reasons I wanted both of you here for this conversation is not only because you both are a part of the LGBTQ plus community, but also because you're both clinical psychologists, and so you're navigating these spaces from very different from simultaneous lenses. It's both your lived experience, but also aspects of your work. So I want to just kind of think about together, as we've been talking about, parenting during a pandemic has been pretty tough in most households anyway, right? It's just been tough. And that is because of a lot of the things that you both mentioned, or maybe other layers of privilege or lack of resources that families don't have. So it's been pretty tough as it is, especially for those with young children. As the ages both of you talked about having, the ages of my kids, we've seen in a number of different research studies now that parents of younger kids have been impacted more adversely than parents with older kids. So in thinking about how tough it's been, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on whether there have been aspects of pandemic parenting that have made it especially hard for LGBTQ plus families, whether that's been for you personally or others you're connected to, work with, like just what have you seen in the various communities and kind of spheres you inhabit? So David, let's start with you.
I've been thinking about this and trying to disentangle what have been the challenges of pandemic parenting and what may be unique to being a same-sex male couple raising children. And I think a lot of what might be more standard challenges or more stereotypical challenges we haven't had to face, and we've been lucky in that we live in a pretty liberal area in a suburb north of Boston. And our community and our school district has been very welcoming. So things like our kids have been learning a lot from home and cameras. So there are cameras in homes. And for us, our kids were already open with their classmates in their schools about having two dads. So there was no trying to balance what's in the background or what's going to be seen, and that taking away that privacy that is typically there between work and school and home wasn't as much of a challenge. But then I think, one of the both benefits of being in a same-sex couple is there wasn't that automatic assumption of, oh, well, here are the gender roles that we're being told by society that we play. So we are navigating those not because of a predetermined or kind of assumed this is what we're going to be doing as parents, and figuring that out on our own and what fits for us and what works for us. And I think that's been wonderful. At the same time, I feel that being torn between really valuing my work and really valuing my family, and then feeling like I'm not really getting either to the level of quality that I want. And when they're away at school and I'm working, then it's like, oh, well, they're doing their thing and I'm doing my thing. But when they're a room away and then I'm like in a different room, and I feel like I'm like they're right there and I should be doing more, but I'm not. It's just made the choices so much clearer, because one's not out of mind when you're doing the other, because they're all taking place in the same building.
Yeah. And so goes our guilt, right? Like you said, of just all the shoulds. I should be doing this. I should be doing that. Really interesting perspectives. Thank you. Marissa, what do you think?
I echo so much of what David shared. I thought about that too, in terms of there's a real gift in not having these gender stereotypes, these sort of frameworks you just can slip into, that we've had, my wife, we've had to consider, even as far back as who's gonna propose to who? Are we both gonna wear dresses? Everything has had to be this co-creation and really done through a lot of dialogue and sorting out what was best for us as a system. And, I think that muscle was already really well built. And so we've sort of brought that to this pandemic of looking at the system and what's going to work out best, not, what's the sort of assumption that we're going to slip into, but really sort of figuring that out. I think as you're sharing in terms of everything being under one roof, David, the work I do, for some folks I work with clinically, they don't know much about my life. And so here was my life, right? And you have a little kid who's crying and saying, "Mommy, I need you, Mommy." And everyone assumes that's me. And it's like, that's not me. So it's, the visibility and having to navigate those sorts of moments. And, I think is an added layer for LGBT folks that may not be on everybody else's plate.
Yeah. So two things I'm thinking about there. So one is, as you both noted, like the privacy got really tricky, whether it was cameras inside our homes, for our kids and what that meant as they were logging into school and people were seeing who lives in their home and what those dynamics are, but also the reverse of that, like you just mentioned, Marissa, others, in our workplaces kind of seeing into my home, me seeing into theirs, and what that means, especially for LGBTQ plus families that maybe aren't as public with who lives in their home and what the dynamics are between everybody. And so that is very tricky for each member of the family, I think, to navigate in their own way. The other thing you said I really liked too is this idea of intentionality that you both talked about, because you aren't constrained by some of the societal assumptions about gender roles in the home. You got to be very intentional about how you approached this pandemic, whereas maybe in other homes, It is. It's just the default assumption, I was just even thinking that as you both described it, like, school, daycare, they always call me first. They always do. And I am in a heterosexual marriage, right? The default is that I am always the one they reach out to. And so then there's this assumption that I have to deal with it. And that's just been an interesting dialogue, with my husband, who says, why don't they ever call me? Like, I'm home too, and I can help. And you shouldn't always have to assume that you have to be the one to, swoop in and fix whatever the situation is. So it's really interesting to hear you both say, like you said it, Marissa, this is a muscle we already had to flex and practice and strengthen. And we brought that maybe as a strength to navigating the pandemic too. So that even sounded like maybe a benefit or a silver lining, that this is something we were already pretty good at. What are some of the things, maybe some other benefits or silver linings you've seen come up for either you and your homes, or just, communities or folks you've worked with?
It's probably a strange way to put it, but one of the things I've seen, certainly in my clinical work, is, for folks coming into the pandemic who had really complicated relationships with their family of origin, often around their identity, this has been a really interesting time of boundaries, right? They could not be in physical connection anyway with people that often they had very complicated relationships with. And really, for a lot of folks, seeing the impact of that and feeling it, it's like, wow, I have a sort of different sense of space and equilibrium that I didn't quite even know was possible. So it's been an interesting practice for folks to see what that boundary's been like, and then to sort of discuss from there, what are the pieces that you really keep practicing? How do you do it differently as the pandemic shifts over time? So it's been a piece of practice that certainly we wouldn't have predicted unfolding in this way.
Yeah. I see, the same things as being potentially silver linings and real rewards and challenges depending on people's circumstances. In thinking about inviting people into our homes, or inviting sounds like this is something we decided would be fun. Having that choice forced upon us of how much we want to open our homes and cameras and everything, and where we're going to sit and how much we're going to share, I think can open the door for some people who may have been a bit hesitant to say, we're going to be more open with people about who we are and who our family is. And I hope that for many people, that's been a rewarding and affirming experience, and encouraging people to be more open to being who they are and share that with others. But then on the flip side, we know that that's not always the case. And I think this is kind of that balance that we have to hold of the differential responses. I think another is it's opened a world of connecting to community in a way that we hadn't before. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, and I imagine we'll talk about this some too in youth, the kind of the isolation and all the challenges of isolation experienced in a way that we as a society, at least no one living, has experienced before to this degree. There's also been a whole bunch of connection and people figuring out how to connect online in different ways. And whether that's professionally in teletherapy and being able to work with people through computers, and people who may not have been able to travel to clinics or have a talk with therapists from the comfort of their own home. And for people who may be in the closet or who may not have people and community physically around them or close enough to connect to, now it's opened up even more that you could find community in different places, in different means.
Yeah, and that connection piece strikes me as maybe both a pro and a con, right? In the ways you're both describing, and that we could put in some boundaries around who we wanted to see, not see, maybe who it's painful to see right now or complex, as you described. I'm thinking, especially not only have we been in the midst of a pandemic, right, but we've also been in this whole, year and a half of lots of civil unrest, systemic racism, a lot of other pieces to this. We've also had a pretty, in the US, contentious election. So, I'm thinking about how many parents we talked with who were actually quite relieved that they didn't have to go to the Thanksgiving family gathering, right around election time. And so, I think there are benefits to that. I wonder too about the flip side, though, in the creative ways you were talking, David, about connection, especially using technology. Have there been some maybe added risks or challenges with that around who people are connecting with online? Just think about the isolation piece and who we are reaching out to, which maybe tend to be people similar to us, or, groups where we can find support, which is great. But then what has that sort of done for the dialogue we're maybe used to having with people who don't see things the same we are?
So I think there's not the safety checks that there may be in-person schooling. And of course, what kind of safety checks are there depends a lot on the district and what the district's looking for and what's kind of normalized in whatever part of the country and whatever school district and whatever the leadership is. But, there's the opportunity to connect with more established, affirming, helpful resources and communities. And there's also a lot online, as we all know, that is not all that helpful and could be harmful. And there's also a lot of people in groups looking for vulnerable, at-risk youth to bring in to what I would consider dangerous and harmful ideologies, and like alt-right, by using memes and other methods to try to get youth and everyone into more divisive places. So I think that's a risk, and not just a risk, but something we know happens. And I think without in-person connection, it may be harder to catch that. Even for youth who find, and parents and people who find good community online, there's more effort that you need to take the step to do that. Mm-hmm. And youth who's struggling, if they are taking the steps, they may reach out to the Trevor Project and speak with someone on the helpline and learn about more resources and connect with affirming support. But a youth who may not think to do that or not want to take that step, if they're all at home, there may not be people at school or other adults to say, like, I think this person's really struggling and could use some help.
Yeah.
I think more people may slip through the cracks.
Yeah, I think a lot about age and how complicated, especially I think about young trans and gender non-binary youth, right? And there's a real lack of support for them in general. And then you look at what they had available to in terms of online resources. And, I was talking to a mother a couple weeks ago, and she said, look, I really pushed for my younger kid to have access to a group that was a little bit older than what the criteria was, right? And this kid needed the support and the connection and just to combat some of that isolation so badly, and yet was sort of exposed to, sort of concepts, things that kid developmentally wouldn't have otherwise been thinking about. And so there is this, sort of double-edgedness. I think all the pieces that we're talking about today just require this real consideration of context. It's like, where is that balance between where the benefit is and where the potential risk is? And
yeah, and we know that especially, now kind of shifting our focus to thinking about kids and parents trying to help kids that may be, already identified as part of the LGBTQ plus community, or questioning, or just trying to learn more, figure it out. So we already know that kids falling under any of those descriptions are at higher risk for a lot of things, like David was talking about, maybe exposure to groups or people trying to victimize them, bullying, depression, suicide, and lots of mental health challenges. So as we think about already the higher level of risk, are there aspects that you've observed from our time, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic that have made these youth especially vulnerable?
Yeah, it really is. It's the group I worry the most about in terms of what they already had access to, even thinking about in the times where youth need to access a higher level of care, and how tricky that is on the best of circumstances. And then you add in the pandemic, and it's been complicated to access care from a COVID perspective in terms of just availability. And then you think about what's available in terms of really, informed care for trans and gender non-binary kids. And that's the group that I've been really concerned about. And,
I think the isolation is really key, and the removal or less access to more of the routines and standard interactions with people through school. And for some youth, this may be a benefit if there was bullying and stress. But there are certainly some youth who this is the best of all worlds. They get to get the education not have to deal with a toxic environment at school. But for many youth, it is even more isolation. and less opportunity to engage in fun activities in the types of ways that we would encourage youth, especially depressed youth, to find things with other people that are fun to do, some things that are fun to do alone and with other people. And that's one of the things that works best to help people lift their mood, doing fun things. And that's been really, really hard over the past year. And then I think it's brought to the forefront some of the challenges, especially like for trans youth who may be in a part of their development where they don't want as much focus of people looking at them. And then they have a camera directly in their face, often with their legal name written right underneath the camera, that this is how they need to, that there's much more of a focus on challenges like this. And I think the other challenges I'd see for youth and LGBTQ plus youth specifically are the context. And I think that is one, the family context, that for youth with supportive parents or supportive families, that being at home, they may still get that support. But we know that many LGBTQ plus youth in our country are not getting affirmation and support from their families of origin, and taking away the connections from school and other social connections, there's even less support there. And as Marissa noted, and as you noted, Amanda, it's not just bad and unfortunate, it's dangerous and a huge risk to the lives of these youth not having that support. And then our country, it's been a stressful time, and an especially stressful time for LGBTQ plus youth who are caught in the pandemic and also caught in culture wars that are often trying to use their identities and diminish their identities and disrespect their identities in order to gain political standing. And youth are aware of that, just like we're all aware of that. And that has a big impact. We saw LGBTQ plus youth mental health go up after same-sex marriage was made the law of the land. And we see mental health go down when there are national policies, transphobic policies, and other national policies that don't respect who they are as people.
Yeah. At Pandemic Parenting, we're committed to sharing our expertise and research in ways that are immediately accessible and useful to families. As part of our efforts to sustain and expand this work, Lindsay and I are also available for virtual speaking engagements at your business, organization, PTO, and more. We want to help you and those who you work with, grow with, and raise your children with have the chance to do so in an environment that fosters and supports your mental health. Some of the topics we enjoy speaking on include parenting during the pandemic, the impact of trauma on children and families, children's development, the mental health impact of COVID-19 on employees, and more. If you or your organization are interested in potentially collaborating, please reach out to us for availability and pricing through the Request a Speaker form on our website at www.pandemic-parent.org/contact.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about, as we think about, maybe the kids we're most worried about through this, as you kind of both were bringing up examples. For me too, it's been thinking a lot about things like child maltreatment rates, emotional abuse, neglect, those kinds of things, as kids have been locked in homes. And as you both are pointing out, maybe kids who aren't seen in their homes, right, in the ways that they are struggling and fighting to be seen. And so when we have taken them away in lots of ways from other people who fill their buckets, other people who see them at school, whether it's peers or teachers or just who do really see them and understand them, and they may not be getting that at home. I think some of our conversation so far has been operating from the assumption of supportive parents, parents who really want to make sure that their kids are getting what they need throughout this. But that isn't the story for a lot of the youth that we're talking about. And so as they have struggled to find those connections and be seen in the ways that they desperately need to be and want to be, that's a challenge. So if we just sort of think about, parents who recognize this risk in their kids or see that their kids are struggling, you both are amazing clinicians. And so I want to tap into your expertise there too. What sorts of things can parents of LGBTQ plus youth, what sort of things, I guess, should they keep on their radar? Should they keep an eye out for to make sure that their child is supported and not falling through the cracks, as you mentioned, David, which we're seeing a lot of kids fall through the cracks right now. So yeah, what can parents do to support these kids?
One of the things that you mentioned, David, is really even that camera piece, right? Of what does it mean for kids to be seen? And for some kids, especially trans and gender non-binary kids, this is an opportunity to sort of try some things on, get a sort of more titrated response from their environment. For other kids, like David had mentioned, just to be seen is such a painful experience. And one of the first things that comes to my mind, Amanda, when you ask is about curiosity. Really as parents, it's been a very stressful time and our curiosity can really sort of fly out the window. And so how do we remind ourselves to come back and say, okay, step one, sort of name what's going on and to be curious about it. And the assumption can be, this kid just isn't motivated, whatever it is. It's like, wait, can we be openly curious about what's going on? And especially for these youth, really widening that range, if parents can tolerate it, right? To say, you don't even have to choose a place to be on this continuum, right? To really be as curious about how they feel, give them as much space as they can, and really be, noticing for changes. Are they withdrawing, from the things that they used to love to do? Are they irritability? These sorts of things that we're noticing a shift in. And at first meeting it with some naming of it, and then really, I think, diving in with some curiosity to just try our best to understand what's going on.
I think that's super important. And I think it does put more of a burden on parents, especially when kids aren't in school physically or aren't interacting with as many other people, because that very natural teen response of like, I don't want to talk about it, sometimes is a little bit easier to fly if they're also, they meet with their guidance counselor weekly to check in at school and things like that. But if there's not as much interaction, then it puts parents in a position of being like, I understand you don't want to talk about it, but I also need to make sure you're doing okay. And we don't need to talk about everything, but I need to make sure you're safe. I realized in thinking back to what I was just saying a few minutes ago, sometimes it's very tempting, and I could fall into that trap of like thinking about parents of like the supportive parents and the not supportive parents, when we know it's not like either you are dressed in full rainbow garb with like waving flags, or you're completely against LGBTQ plus youth. Like I think the portion of parents who are like super, super against LGBTQ plus youth, one, probably aren't listening to this podcast. And I think they're like a pretty small portion who like are just like, you know what, if my kid's gay, I don't care about them. If my kid's trans. And I think that's great that is such a small portion. But I think there's a lot of parents in a very understandable way who love their kid, want the best for their kid, but don't have a lot of experience with LGBTQ plus populations, with people who've gone through this and don't know what this will mean for their child, even for very supportive parents. And I think the vast majority of parents who truly love their children and want the best for them, some confusion about how to be supportive and how to be supportive of their child, even if they're not really sure how they feel about an LGBTQ plus identity. And they aren't really ready to support an LGBTQ plus identity. And I think there's probably a good chunk of parents who fall into that. I will say, even this is disclosure I don't usually make, but I'm very comfortable making. Like when I came out to my mother went to college for music. All of her male friends from college and from growing up in New York City, like she had more gay male friends than she had straight male friends. So very immersed in like the gay scene in New York. And when I came out to her first response was like, but what is this going to mean about your life? And what is like, are you going to be able to like have a family? And it wasn't anything anti-gay. It was just, you as a parent, you imagine what your child's life and who your child is and what it's going to be like. And when that's shifted, that takes adjustment. And that doesn't mean anything bad about being a parent. And what I'd say for that, and I would say my mom came around very quickly, but it took processing, right? Think about how you could support your child and be there for them and let them know that you are there for them and that you're going to learn. You like may not understand it all now, but you want to learn so you could talk about it together and figure out how to support them best. And that doesn't mean that you need to automatically know everything or do everything, but then reaching out to places like PFLAG and other resources. And maybe we could share some posts on the website after for parents
Absolutely.
who are like, I think this is what's going on, or my child told me this is what's going on, but I don't really know about it. My child doesn't really want to talk about it. And I need to learn. I'd like to learn more or speak with other parents who are in that similar position of figuring out, coming to terms.
I think that it's just such an important point. I really appreciate you bringing that up. Like how many parents don't even know, like you said, they're not in this extreme category, one or the other. Like, I don't even know that I should be in this conversation because I didn't even know my child was struggling in this way to kind of figure this out. So, right, like we don't know what we don't know, and this willingness to sort of learn. So I think that, I want to just ask you both that as a follow-up, and I don't mean to put you on the spot with this. So if you're not comfortable answering, that's totally fine. But I'm curious about, what sort of things should parents look out for that maybe I should be bringing this up with my child or asking about, any number of struggles they might be facing, but especially questioning identity, sexual orientation, whatever it might be. Are there sort of better ways? I know there's not always a perfect way or a right, or I know there are wrong ways for sure, but what are some ways or tips you might have for how parents can sensitively and compassionately bring this up with their child? Because as you noted, David, you often, especially when we're talking about some of these adolescent ages, you're going to get I'm fine, I don't want to talk about it, everything's fine, no matter what, right? Really often, no matter what you're asking your kids about. But so, what are your thoughts around how parents can be curious, like you mentioned, Marissa, but maybe in better ways?
The first thing that comes to my mind is starting early and often. For our kids, a different dynamic, but we didn't want there to be a one-day conversation to say, look, here's how you came to be. We need to sit you down. It's just been always a part of the conversation. And same with around gender identity for our kids. That there are so many great books out there now, and I'm happy to share some, as David mentioned. That really, it doesn't need to be a big conversation or sort of a newsflash moment. It's like, this is just part of our sort of language and culture as a family. It's look at how many different ways boys can dress. Look at how many different ways girls can have their hair. So I think optimal scenario, if people have the resources and if it sort of works internally for them, is to really start early. And so that it's just introduced. It's like there's just a range and that's just known. Down the road, I think it is sort of introducing those ideas as gently as we can, that there are so many different ways to be. And because kids are, especially in certain developmental ages, they're so binary, right? It's like, but I'm either this or that. And how do we help our kids help what is developmentally normative, right? But sort of expand that out, which it's really hard. I come back to sort of naming and just sort of leaving room over time for different ways to be.
And there are so many opportunities for that, right? I'm thinking about, one of my kids was just looking on a store's website, right, the other day, and he had a gift card, and so he was kind of searching for what he wanted, and he said, "What does this mean, Mom? It says boys, girls, or neutral." And I was like, "Oh, let's talk about that," right? And so it was just, like you said, it doesn't have to be this big sit down, the talk that we have. I love these, teachable moments that come up on an, very often, very frequent basis. So just capitalizing on those and leaning into your child's curiosity rather than kind of being afraid of that or avoiding it. And so many great books and representation, we're seeing now to just introduce into their vocabulary, into their experiences. Makes a lot of sense. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything each of you have said, and I think there's like books, and there's just so much media out there now, and there is fortunately a lot more representation, and each year it's more and more. So I think for younger kids where you have more control, like for our 6-year-olds, like we could pick out books from the library, and any time we're like, hey, well, you want to read this? They'll be like, sure. If you're going to sit down and read to me, like, game most of the time. For older kids and teens, it may be more when watching shows, when seeing celebrities in the media who are LGBTQ plus identified, to just let know in passing comments, oh, did you see, like, oh, that's great. Did you see so-and-so and so-and-so got married? Or so-and-so announced that they've transitioned, or they're transitioning, or like, how brave. Like, so even like a passing comment for a child or a teen who is thinking about that, or is having some internal processing and figuring out about identity, many will be really attuned to those comments. And even a passing comment of, oh, that, that person announce that they're transgender and they're going to transition. Like, how brave of them to share that. Like, I think that like a passing comment could go a long way. I think we could fall down a bit of a rabbit hole if we think too much about like, well, what are the indicators that someone is? Because then like it's hard to distinguish like the stereotypes. We don't want to start saying like, hey, you're a boy in musical theater. Like, so do you have anything you want to tell me? And granted, I was a boy who's in musical theater and my husband teaches in musical theater. Like, it's not like an unheard of thing, but just because you're a boy in musical theater doesn't mean you're gay. And I imagine that a lot of boys in musical theater are getting that a lot from their peers. Like, they don't need their parent being like, so I noticed you tried out for the school show. I just want you to know if you're gay, that's fine with me. Like, that may, but if a child or a teen is asking, it was like saying things about, oh, did you know, what do you think of that guy? I thought he was cute. Like, if your son's saying that, like, then maybe that opens a little bit of like, oh yeah, me too. Like, you know, like it opens a little bit more of they're giving clues or hints or like testing out the conversations and more opportunities to engage in the conversation there.
Yeah, I think that we see kids testing out what we think about things a lot indirectly, like you're saying, right? That they'll sometimes float to you, oh, you know, I heard this about this kid at school. Can you believe that, Dad? And it's their way of really taking the pulse of how you're going to respond if it ever were to be about them. So, but I don't think that in our busyness, right? Or I'm making dinner and you just kind of floated this comment out there or this question and I didn't. I think sometimes as parents, we have to pause or reflect or think about, wait a minute, I wonder what, you know, get curious, like Marissa was saying, I wonder what was happening there or what they were asking about, or were they, you know, trying to see how I'd react to that? Because I don't think it's as simple as all of us are pointing out, right? Of having the big conversation where they sit down or we sit them down and say, I'm noticing these things. I do think it's much more the accumulation of all these little moments that set the stage for if and when they will feel safe to disclose to us something they're struggling with, whatever that might be.
For me, that brings some comfort too, in that is never like window of opportunity opens and then it shuts. And if you missed it because you were busy cooking or you had this deadline that you like, your kid said something, you're like, I'm sorry, I need to work right now. Like, there's just constant windows, or there could be constant windows where you could say something or where they'll bring stuff up. And I think that's really great to think of it in a way of this is a continuous thing. The opportunity is never lost.
Yeah, I think that's a message that Lindsay and I have been trying to hammer home with parents this whole, year and a half or so is we get do-overs, like whether it's talking to your kids about COVID, whether it's talking to your kids about their gender identity, anything, challenges your family's facing, that you don't have to get it right and perfectly every time. We get to come back and say, when I brought up such and such last night, like, I don't think I did a good job asking you about that, or I might have been more confusing. Could we talk about that again? Or could we try that again? It's also great modeling for our kids to see us come back and revisit conversations, maybe apologize if we didn't get it right, or we weren't as sensitive, or maybe we weren't listening. Like you said, David, I think about how many times I've just been so busy trying to work from home, and I dismiss, like, okay, can we talk about that in a few minutes? And I didn't realize that was a missed opportunity, that my child got up the courage to come and tell me something, and I just was so dismissive or distracted. But we get to come back to that and say, it seems like you had something really important to tell me earlier. I'm sorry that I was distracted. Could we try again? Just to take the pressure off, getting it right the first time, every time.
And
such important modeling.
Yeah. That is one of the, I think, greatest comforts in the way that both of you are talking, is really seeing the power of repair, that it's not even as if it's, we have the chance to come back to it. It's like, that is such a gift to kids. And, working with adults, I see it on the other end too, how that repair matters. And then you sort of go back in time, which takes a lot of resource and privilege to be able to be in a place where you can do that. Gosh, if we can do that, to really go back to something, to repair it, to own what we can, we're not even letting ourselves off the hook. We're really giving our kids a real gift. And the more we see it that way, I think it frees us up, and such an important model for our kids.
Yeah.
Just a comforting thought, or that I had, and now I wish I remembered when I was listening to it was another podcast that was talking about trends across generations, and something like parents in the 50s or 60s spent so much less time with their kids than we as parents are spending today. like as kids like come home, they're doing their own thing, like, and all that. And that always makes me feel a little bit better. Not that I want that where I'm not spending like hardly any time with my kids, but thinking about kind of the expectations and the pressure just that's exacerbated by social media and everything of thinking like, oh, well, we need to do like this with the kids and every moment is a quality time. And then I see these like what I think are intending to be inspirational quotes online of like, you only have this number of weekends from when your child is born to when your child goes to college. And it feels like such pressure of like, you need to make every moment, like maximize it and make it count. And like, no, it's really not. Or at least is what I keep telling myself. Of like, we have a lot of pressure to like make every moment count. And like, sometimes kids could like do their own thing. And you don't always need to be engaging in a positive educational growth opportunity. Like they could do their thing, we could do our thing, and we have the quality time together. But I think the expectations of parents these days has gone way, way up and more than what most of our kids actually need.
That's right. And what the research supports, what you're saying, that it is so much more about the quality of time we spend with our kids than the quantity. That, there's a big difference between if I am giving my child my undivided attention for 5 quality minutes of we're doing what you want, I am totally enraptured with what we're doing, you have me all to yourself. That's very different than if I'm sitting next to you and we're both on our phones for 3 hours or scrolling some device, but not really engaging. You're always going to want to take the quality of that enriched experience together than the quantity of time. So I think you're exactly right. And we put so much pressure to make every single moment count. When actually, speaking of gifts, it's also a gift for your child to feel boredom, to experience that, to figure out how to fill their time in ways that they enjoy or feel meaningful to them. And so it's okay for kids to feel bored. So, think about how our parents responded to I'm bored versus the pressure we put on ourselves to respond to our kids in a very different way, to swoop in and fill that time versus letting them navigate that for themselves. So speaking of, Marissa was talking about repairs, and it just sort of makes me think about repairs on a much more sort of systemic policy level. We've learned a lot of things throughout the pandemic. And so I'm curious from both of your perspectives about maybe ways the pandemic has magnified some existing inequalities or challenges that were already there for LGBTQ plus families, and what might need to be some policies or changes we see moving forward. Like what lessons should we take from this last year and a half and move forward?
It's a big question.
I know.
And a really important question. The two that jump out at me, Amanda, are really around housing and the workforce, right? Even thinking about for transgender, and non-binary folks, the shakiness of, are my rights going to be protected to not have access to a job or to have my employment terminated? We have a lot of work, I think, to do in terms of helping LGBT plus folks navigate a workforce where there's still discrimination and shakiness in terms of protection there. And housing insecurity, it's I think a significant concern, especially for transgender and non-binary folks, really, especially for folks who are not in a safe, who really need to leave and need shelter, and that there are few resources, even in metropolitan areas, that are really safe, trained, and places that people can land. So from a housing perspective, and I think certainly from a workforce perspective, it I think has really made that clear that there's a lot of work to do on those fronts.
I completely agree. And I think discrimination against people based on who they are or whom they love should be illegal nationwide. It shouldn't depend on what zip code you live in, whether or not someone could turn you away from a job or an apartment. That shouldn't be allowed anywhere. And I think, especially in times of financial stress and growing income inequality and a pandemic of racism, that LGBTQ plus individuals who are already at greater risk in a number of these areas, and then people with intersecting identities are even at greater risk. I think as much as we could do to limit and reverse that discrimination is certainly needed.
Well, and it just makes me think about with, what you're both describing. I think a lot about how resilient LGBTQ plus families are, and it's because they have had to be, right? So resilience is this developed, we have to strengthen our resiliency. We aren't just born with it. And so families that have either LGBTQ plus parents or kids or both have had to fight harder for many things, right? Have experienced lots of discrimination and disparity, as you both just sort of pointed out. And so I'm also seeing, as we're talking about and thinking about the ways that families in the LGBTQ plus community have had to weather this period differently than other families. So lots of resilience and adaptability that are there as compared to, say, traditional families not experiencing those things. So just kind of keeping in mind those pieces, right? Or that perspective. I guess I just want to know, as kind of a final sign off, like, what do you want to say to other LGBTQ plus families? What is rolling around in there for you, and what sort of message do you have for other families navigating these things too?
Or my main message would be one of community. And I think generations ago, one of the biggest challenges for LGBTQ plus people was finding community, because you weren't born into, or your family had that same identity as other identities may be. And what I see is opportunities, and I would encourage everyone, as difficult as it may be, to try to find where your community is, if you haven't found it yet. And I think the hopeful words is that there are communities out there, and there is a community for you, and especially to youth. You will find people who are a community for you. And LGBTQ parents as plus as well. And whether that's online, whether that's finding resources and connecting with groups in person, I think community is one of the most important pieces.
I think support is the main piece, whether that's for your LGBTQ kids, whether that's for yourself as a parent of an LGBTQ kid who's navigating that process, or as an LGBTQ parent. And so I think support is huge. And the other piece I've been thinking about a lot is really that we have to be gentle with ourselves. And it takes energy to advocate when you move through the world in a minority status of any kind, right? And to be careful with yourself about when you can take on more and when you need to sort of slow down, take care of yourself and your own family before you can sort of make another push in terms of really helping to change some of the social dynamics at play in your own community. So I think first, getting support, feeling a sense of visibility, and you're not the only one with a certain family structure or identity, is huge. And then beyond that, I really feel like parents to really just, as much as they can, to be gentle with themselves and realize how much effort goes in, even invisible effort, in terms of navigating systems when you're in a minority status.
Thank you. Very, very powerful and helpful guidance from you both. So I just want to thank you for joining us and for sharing aspects both of your professional expertise, but also each of your lived experiences. I really think that just helps us all feel part of a community, right? And know that we are seen and we are not the only ones struggling with this, and that there's no right way to do this. And so thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. Make sure to hit follow or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever platform you're listening on to be notified of future episodes. We'd also love to connect with you on social media. Look for our blue and yellow logo when you search Pandemic Parenting on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or YouTube, and you'll find us. Or follow the links in the show notes.
Let us know what you think of this episode by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. Your 5-star review helps us move up the charts to reach even more parents and caregivers. If you have a specific question or topic you'd like us to address in a future episode, let us know. You can email info@pandemic-parent.org and mention podcast in the subject line.
And this podcast isn't all we do, by the way. Pandemic Parenting is a 501c3 nonprofit providing free science-based resources for parents and all who care for children while navigating the COVID-19 pandemic. To learn more about our organization and access our extensive library of webinars, videos, blogs, and more, visit www.pandemic-parent.org.
Lastly, this show wouldn't be possible without supporters like you. Lindsay and I donate our time to this podcast, but we do have an incredible team working behind the scenes to make this all happen. If you'd like to support the show beyond leaving your 5-star review, visit www.pandemic-parent.org/support and donate today.
Thanks for listening. Hope you can join us next time.